Hello, and welcome to the Q&A. I do these every single Saturday, and I answer your questions that I find interesting. This is my opportunity to be a geek, so if you don't find any of the stuff here particularly familiar, then feel free to ask in the comments for clarifications. These will just be answers that just pop into my head. There won't be any scripting behind this. Hello everyone, and welcome to the third Q&A. I just wanted to make it clear to all of the new people that have come from Coach Red Pill's channel and also from Academic Agents channel that if you ask questions in the description, they will be put onto a Q&A session if they're interesting enough. We've got some very interesting questions today on Islam, religion, and just on, learning, applying practically knowledge of certain religions and how we act in the world with them. So today I'm joined by Franzel. Say hi, Franzel.
Hi.
And by Hasan. Say hi, Hasan.
Hiya.
Okay, so first question that I've gotten is one that Hasan knows quite a lot about because you're of course related to Islam. Like maybe you want to tell the audience what you've done there with Islam.
Yeah, I've come on some of your content before, and basically my background is from a Shiite family. I'm actually a Sayyid. I'm a descendant of Muhammad directly. And around December is when I decided to start converting to Catholicism. Although I'd been considering it for a while before, and I had doubts and questions for a few years before this, but yeah, that's my background, and I was pretty hardcore. A lot of people who become Christians go through this phase of from Islam. Go through at least a phase of being very secular and not very into their religion. Whereas I'd say I went from immediately from being a very, very zealous Shiite to, well, being very serious about the Church Fathers and Orthodoxy. I didn't really go through a lag phase in between, like a lot of people do.
It was like out of the frying pan into the fire with you, mate.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the question is, do you think that Islam was basically a revamp of Arianism? And I have to say, from what little I know of Islam, decidedly not.
No.
It's much more. It's much more influenced by more Gnostic texts, from what I can tell.
Yeah, and Nestorianism, probably.
Yeah, so we should probably explain what those mean to the people at home who have no bloody idea what this is.
Well, I'll put it this way: the Nestorians prefer the title Christ bearer to Saint Mary, whereas the Orthodox, which includes the Roman Catholics, would call her Theotokos, meaning the God bearer. And that's pretty much a summation of the main problems. It was a Christological difference. The Nestorians believed that, it was basically adoptionism, wasn't it? That he became adopted into divinity.
Well, yeah, they essentially had a problem with reconciling the fact that that Christ was God, and simultaneously that Mary gave birth to God. So they tried to go for like a center position, which just doesn't work. Like we saw this with the Arians. Like the thing is, I'm trying to make this as gentle an introduction as possible for people who don't have any idea about theological controversies, because I think the video I did on the Diorites and the Eastern Orthodox was a little bit dense.
We should then probably explain the question in terms of saying what the Arians were.
Yeah, you
can
right.
do that.
So Arianism, didn't that harken back to the Arian heresy?
Yes.
That's what we're talking about, yeah.
So the Arian heresy... so there's two distinctions. There's most Christianities now that believe Christ is God and is equal to the Father, and is therefore exists outside of time, and just isn't as in his divine essence, as it was called, or ousios. Whereas the Arians believed that Christ was simply the most powerful created being. So he was more like a planet, or just a regular human being, than was God. Although the scriptures don't really support this, and this is why they got, yeeted out of existence. They tried to justify themselves 11 times and just sort of died out and ran away from Rome.
Yeah.
Or away from the Empire.
It was in the time when weird scholasticism was almost on equal footing to scripture and the sacred tradition, because the sacred tradition was kind of still in dispute to some extent, because we didn't have all the writings solidifying it that we do today.
I wouldn't call it scholasticism. I wouldn't call it scholasticism, because then that makes people Aquinas.
Yes, but I mean bad scholarly work.
No, I wouldn't say it like that. What I'd say is it was more of a transition between the sort of superhero gods of the pagans and what we know now in the authentic Catholic and Orthodox churches.
That's probably a good way of dealing with it. It's like a midway between pagan deification. Go on.
There's one thing that I need to explain, because I've gotten a lot of comments off the Coach Red Pill crowd, and they don't really have much of a conception of what faith actually means, as cringeworthy and kind of Protestant as that sounds, right? Like, they think it's all feelings, and understandably, that's what's been pushed from the top. No, it decidedly isn't. There's reams and reams of philosophy and syllogisms and things like that behind these sorts of things. These are studies in the exact same way, and probably in a lot of ways in excess of scientific studies, right? They often rely on pure reason for their entire formation, and as much as you may scoff at that, you can go read. And that's partly what my channel is there for, so you can go read. So, bearing that in mind, let's actually kill the question a bit better.
Yeah, I mean, let's be clear here. This is something that I've noticed is a problem. A lot of people like to watch YouTube and not read. Please, after listening to us answer these questions, go read about the things we say. Please, don't be retarded.
We should probably give some book recommendations, actually. One book that I'd recommend, this isn't strictly related to Islam, but you could go after a lot of Islam with it, would be, just the books by Ed Feser. The Introduction to Scholastic Metaphysics is one of the more complicated ones, but a good starting point would be The Last Superstition. Yeah. And I'll link these in the description with Amazon links.
I can't recommend any reading from Western scholarly work or academia on Islam. I could only recommend you to read books from the Islamic tradition.
Can I take notes?
Which
I can put them in the description very quickly. Yeah.
Well, yeah, the main 6 authentic books, or most authenticated books used by the Sunnis, and then the big 4 books used by the Shiites for hadiths. This is going to be a long list. We'll just stay with the hadiths for now.
If you could just give them one book.
Yeah.
Because I don't know about you, but I don't have enough interest to go into Islam in much depth. And I doubt that considering how much I read, I doubt that many other people are going to obsess over it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, then it's not really going to be that useful for most people to read into it. If they want to understand, Islamic philosophy, they should read a book that I was reading in Ephraim's server with Franzel, called it's by a scholar named Sayyid Baqir al-Sadr, and his book is called Our Philosophy. Our Philosophy. Yeah, as in Islamic philosophy, but he means specifically 12 Shiite philosophy. And anybody who's acquainted with Aquinas or Aristotle will notice that his work is a lot more Aristotelian than you would expect, but it's still not all the way there. But it's a good book. It's mostly a commentary on liberal capitalism and socialism and how they're both wrong, and he puts forward a religious third way kind of ideology.
Third position? You mean third way is what Blair did?
Oh yeah, third position. Sorry, it's late.
Well, Mussolini and Blair, very different people, very.
Yeah, you're right. Well, which one killed more? I don't know. So, anyway, let's if we go back to the question, if we briefly go back to what Arianism is, you can look at it as a sort of midway between the pagan concept of deification and the divinization or theosis, which is in Orthodox Christian thought.
The deification of Orthodox Christian thought. So, I mean, you see, you've just thrown out another term. these are different terms.
I was going to try to quickly explain it. So the main aim of Christianity for the individual is to attain godhood, but not ontologically. So you don't become the creator, you don't become, the source of all existence, but you have the holiness of God, and that's what a saint is. I mean, the word saint comes from, sanctified, and that comes from the Latin sanctus, literally holy. So the saint just means a holy person, and a person is only holy by God's holiness. So, when you're in heaven, you basically have that.
Okay, I'll try and explain it for the audience.
I've tried to explain all of them.
I think I can come up with the best way of describing it, right? Because Maximus the Confessor explained it pretty well. So,
yeah.
Think of the time when Jesus is in the Garden of Gethsemane, and he's praying to God to liken his will unto him, and he sweats blood. That's one. I mean, that's the first mystery of the sorrowful mysteries, and it's well known by effectively everyone.
We prayed it today.
Effectively. Well, I mean, I prayed Luminous, but it's Thursday, isn't it?
Oh, yeah.
But
I did the wrong ones. Oops.
Whoopsie daisy. So essentially, what theosis or sanctification is that process. It's the likening of the will unto that of God. So, it's not so much that process. I mean, regarding Arianism, it's more like Arianism is essentially just saying that Christ isn't God.
Yeah,
and
that Christ had to go through theosis, but didn't become even ontologically God. Like,
he sort of developed into. He sort of developed.
He's like the first saint. That's the way they look at it.
I mean, they go and look at like the part where Christ is getting baptized, and they say, well, he grew in wisdom, and thus he couldn't have been God. Yet at the same time, he's saying, before Abraham was, I am, which implies that he's outside of time, and also likens back to the Old Testament, Yahweh, because Yahweh is actually, by many linguists, believed to be a primitive, ancient Hebrew infinitive form, or like neutral form of he who is, or to be. And I mean, he says as much to Moses when he's talking to him through the burning bush. I am that I am. He defines himself as pure actuality when he introduces himself.
Yep. Ehya Asher Ehya. He says it in the first person, and Yahweh is just the third person of the same word, Ehya. It's just a different form of the same word.
He that is.
Mm-hmm.
So,
so to go on to Islam,
to go on to Islam, no, decidedly not. In fact, a lot of the inspiration I've seen from Islam is more Docetist, which believed that Christ was God, but not man.
It's kind of Islam has a very you got to remember that Islam is more than one school of philosophy. You've got Sufis, particularly the Sufis who believe in oneness of existence meme, which is wahdatul wujud. That's what it is in Arabic, and they basically are pantheists. They're nuts. They believe that your toilet and its contents are part of God. We'll just leave it there, right? And then you've got the you've got the Asherites and the Atharites and the Maturides, who agree on quite a lot when it comes to the nature of God. And these all hold that, for example, the Quran, in its purest form, in the form of pure revelation, so not a book, but the actual idea itself, is indistinct from the essence of God.
That's crazy.
And because they say speech is indistinct from the speaker. They get part of it right. They're like, well, the word has to be the same as the speaker, has to be indistinct, and then they can't go any further.
Excuse me if I'm wrong, Hasan, but as far as I understood, the Quran was taught to Muhammad by the Archangel Gabriel.
Yeah.
So what's the conclusion of that?
Yeah. Well, But it wasn't Gabriel's speech, according to
How
Islam.
can something finite like Gabriel speak something infinite like God, though?
Well, that's part of the point. The point is that the Quran, as it was given to Gabriel, was infinite, but then it had to go through a finite medium in order to be received by the mind of man.
But like what? Like how can a finite thing comprehend something infinite?
It can't. That's why the Quran was then limited, and so the form that was taught to Muhammad was in itself
No, but
finite compared to.
I'm talking about the limited intellect of the Archangel Gabriel.
I know. That's why it became finite before it was even given to Muhammad. Like it became words. It became individual words. It became, 100 and something chapters. It stopped being, the pure revelation itself. Basically, is what it was before.
So what the Ash'arites think is that, say, Allah spoke the words unto Gabriel. Gabriel received a limited form and spoke that unto Muhammad, and
Yeah.
Muhammad he received an even more limited form.
Yeah, but that doesn't mean that they believe it was corrupted in any way. It just decreased in its, in basically what was available of it. So what remained is not considered to be like incorrect or susceptible to being incorrect. So, I mean, you can look at it in a similar way to how we look at the books of the prophets. They have inevitably changed in some words, but we keep the meaning, whereas the Ash'arites deny that the words have changed at all. And then you've got the other school, the Mu'tazilites and the Imamis, or the Shiites, who mostly agree that the Quran is a created entity, and that speech is distinct from the speaker. And what they hold is that it's speech after having been articulated, so that it cannot be indistinct from the creator. It doesn't follow. And what they hold is that they draw on certain narrations, Islamic narrations, which the Asharite the schools of hadith science that the Asharites tend to hold to don't reject these hadiths either. And what they hold is that that Muhammad himself has said, and his cousin Ali also said, that they were Quran al-Mu'addab, which means, the Quran articulate, the Quran, like, you can think of it as the Quran in human form. So, if you're going to argue that the Quran is indistinct from God, and then your prophet is saying in narrations that your scholars have authenticated that he is the Quran, you've got a bit of an issue on your hands, which they never really rectified, and which the Shiites, and there's no real Mu'tazilites left in the modern day, there's very few, but the Shiites often use this as a way to argue that Sunnis are, pagans, basically, because
I thought it was more to
they
do
would
with
be.
the fact. I thought it was more to do with the fact that some of them treat the 99 names of Allah as like distinct emanations.
This is true as well, but you've got to think of God being the one who reveals as one of his names, and so the revelation is also part of that. Like you can look at it like this: the Sunnis believe that God has, and it's not just 99. Those are just the names that are mentioned in the Quran, but there are other names as well, and there's some hadiths that contain other names of God. And these names basically describe God's existence, but in limited human language. Now, the Shiites and the Mu'tazilites argue that all of these names describe a human characteristic, which when taken to infinity becomes equal to all the other ones, like, infinite justice is infinite mercy, and so on. And so they all end up being the same thing, which is God. And it's very similar to, the idea of energies and essence being indistinct. Whereas the Sunnis generally, especially the Asharites, they tend to hold that the Asharites always hold, but other Sunnis also tend to hold that these 99 different descriptions describe different characteristics or attributes of God, and that these attributes are actually enumerated, and that they basically, God has a ma'na, or an essence, which is distinct from his attributes, and that these attributes are co-eternal with his essence and are possessed by him, which is
That's
something
like
that,
that's like Valentinianism.
yeah, or Neopalamism.
Oof.
But yeah,
Oof.
yeah, yeah.
Debate me.
It's actually more like Neopalamism. Yeah, exactly.
Debate me, Crosscock.
Yeah. So this is the thing. When you start looking into this stuff and you realize that there are different schools of Islamic philosophy, but none of them match up to Arianism in any way. So yeah, I wouldn't say it's like a revamp of the Arian heresy at all.
I mean, it always struck me as a lot, like we were saying, a lot more linked with, say, Valentinius, or those Gnostics that wrote the Gospels of the Nag Hammadi. So the Gospel of Truth,
and
the Gospel of
yeah,
Thomas, etc., etc.
Yeah, and you've got to remember that Islam's soteriology is completely different. It's not, well, unless you're a Sufi, it's not Gnostic, but it isn't. It isn't like faith alone Protestantism either. It's a lot more like Catholicism in that they hold the same idea that your works are the face of your faith, and if you have genuine faith, then you will act upon it when you have opportunity to do so. And so there will be works, unless you're very unlucky. There will be works to prove your faith.
I mean, yeah, the thing is though, is it seems to have been very strongly intellectually influenced in its, and that's probably by virtue of the fact that Muhammad was in Mecca, and south of the Roman Empire was a real playground for these sorts of ideas. I mean, Nag Hammadi is in Egypt, for example. And, a lot of these people...
And Hijaz, where Muhammad was in Mecca, just south of Nabatea, is where the Hasmoneans took over as well.
And
and Nabatea was conquered and forcibly converted to Judaism by the Hasmoneans. We have to remember.
The Nabateans getting conquered was a really funny story. Actually, I'll tell it.
Yeah, it's so odd though. It came out of nowhere. But then you've got.
I'll tell the story.
Go on.
So, the Nabateans saw a Roman slave caravan, and they saw that there were women slaves, and they were enraged at this. So they attacked the caravan and freed all of the women slaves. And this was a really stupid mistake because Nabatea is basically Sinai plus a little bit of northern Arabia, right? So a tiny little desert kingdom.
And the southern Levant, yeah.
Oh, did it extend that far north?
Part of Jordan and Syria, yeah. Very far south, Jordan and Syria.
Yeah, so think of like if you're an Old Testament geek, think like Edom plus like a bit of Moab with like some other parts, you've just declared war on the Roman Empire over them having women slaves. You can imagine how it went. You can imagine how it went. That's all I'm saying.
Arab white knights BTFO'd. But yeah, so.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then you actually had like several Jewish dynasties as well in Arabia. Like you had you had the Himyarites in Yemen, were a pretty decent Jewish kingdom. They converted the pagan population to Jewish monotheism, and then they ended up killing all the Christians, which was very lame. And then a lot of after the Axumites came and took over and destroyed their synagogues and built churches in their places, which is really funny. The Jews all ended up migrating north throughout the rest of the Arabian Peninsula. And it was a few centuries after this that Muhammad's story begins. So you've got to think of the Arabian Peninsula, especially the Western Arabian Peninsula, was this hotbed of lots of different religions kind of coalescing in the same place. You had lots of Christians. You had lots of Christians doing missionary activity all over the Arabian Peninsula. In the northeast, which is now western Iraq, you had two Arab Christian kingdoms, the Ghassanids and the
Yeah,
Lahmids.
I was about to mention them, yeah. Because I
Yeah.
recall listening to a podcast called The History of Byzantium talking about there was an Arabic tribe called the Kadali that was originally given a kind of patrician status by Emperor Anastasius of of the Byzantine Empire, and then eventually, I think over time that switches to the Gassids. I think
Ghassanids.
the
Yeah.
Ghassanids, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, you've got all sorts of things going on. Like, one thing that people seem to forget is that Judaism wasn't purely in what the Jews would now call Eretz Israel, so like where Israel is now, the land of Israel. It was also very, very strong in the kingdom of Parthia and eventually the Sassanid Empire. It was very powerful, of course, down south in Arabia, and it even had centres in Western Europe, like in what is now called Marseille. There have been synagogues from, I think, the 4th century AD that were found. They were everywhere, and they were particularly powerful among the Persians and in Arabia.
Yep. Well, because under Cyrus the Great, lots of Jews left Eretz Israel and went all over the rest of the Middle East, the rest of the Achaemenid Persian Empire, and settled all over it.
Yeah, that's part of it, but also later on, I was reading an introduction to the Talmud
Right.
by Aidan Steinsaltz, and he was talking about how, I think it was when the Romans conquered, well, they didn't conquer, they made Herod the Great a client, or around that time, like the client state. A lot of people fled to the capital city of the then Parthian Empire, which I think was called Ctesiphon, and they founded a community there under a Jewish leader called the Exarch, and that became incredibly powerful to the point where this Aidan Steinsaltz fellow speaks about it in equal stead with Eretz Israel. Anyway, let's move on to the next question, because we've been going at this for a good 25 minutes, 27 minutes according to my count. And I'm sure Franzel wants to say something. Okay, so let's continue. How should one approach the spiritual but not religious types? Thank you, Karl Kasczynski, for asking that question. Also, the last one was asked by Skellol. I don't know if I said it.
No.
So my thoughts on the spiritual but not religious types, because there are a lot of those in my audience now, I've noticed, is that they are climbing up. There's two lungs, right? There's reason, and then there's the spiritual kind of, I wouldn't go emotional, but that spiritual side. And they're trying to breathe through one lung, in the same way that these philosophers in universities are only trying to breathe through reason. I mean, if we can even say that for them now. So the problem with being spiritual but not religious is that you're treating.
You can't.
You can't. But that's aside from the point. What people have to fundamentally realise is that spiritualism and philosophy and science and all that, these all exist in the same world, and therefore they are under the same fundamental laws. Though that being the laws of logic. So the law of non-contradiction, the law of identity, and the law of the excluded middle. I'll be doing a video on this for certain, because I really want to talk about this, because I think that if people started thinking in these terms, we'd reach a much more stable society. So the problem is that you're asserting all this spiritual stuff, and a lot of the time people will just read any sort of logic to it. Like the New Age people, they contradict themselves constantly, and they do things which are simply unnatural. Whereas the religions that have persisted up to this point, specifically the Abrahamic ones, but also some of the perhaps higher caste Hinduistic beliefs, they hold to a kind of a facsimile or a superset over what is known as natural law, which are essentially, it is the expression of the best practices of the essence of man. So man has certain things that are innate to it. There are certain actions that he can do innate to himself, and thus we can perfect these, and that's essentially what natural law is. Whereas New Age ignores this because it's completely binned any sort of logic. And I don't say logic and reason in the way of these atheist spurgs who just use it as like a catch-all term. No, I mean reason and logic. I mean formal philosophical logic. I don't mean like if God real, then why I fat. So you gonna say something as well?
Yeah, I'd say that first of all, spirituality is climbing a ladder, and if you don't know where the rungs are, you can't climb it.
A ladder of divine ascent.
So, yeah, exactly. So if you're not religious, well, you're just playing. Sorry.
That's I mean, that's another book that I'd recommend people. The Ladder of Divine Ascent, and it's by Saint John Climacus.
Yep.
I think it was anyway. Well, it was John of Sinai, who might be John Climacus. I might be mixing up with the conferences.
Yeah, you can chuck all these in the description when you.
Yeah, I'm noting them down right now. So.
Yeah. So, I mean, the whole idea of being spiritual but not religious, you have to ask yourself, why? Why are you in this situation? Are you doing it because there are certain passions that you don't want to have to control if you start taking a religion seriously? Or is it because you don't trust any of the religious authorities? And if that's the case, have you really done your due diligence and tried to pay any of them any real mind and look into whether they have the authorities they claim to or not?
I heard Franzel had a comment to make.
I think I kind of think that Hasan's onto something, because for me, if I look at the spiritual but not religious types, it seems to be, on the one hand, it kind of delves into a moralistic therapeutic deism to a certain extent. On the other hand, it's kind of like a surface level criticism of organized religion, or quote unquote organized religion.
I mean, I think there's two distinct types we need to make. We need to make a difference between the eat, pray, love kind of boomer woman, like spiritual but not religious. The kind of like Susan from the parish council if she wasn't in a parish. And this
the woman who fornicates and by the side of the bed prays to her nondescript god afterwards.
Hey, I did some tantric meditation today.
I'm not a Hindu or anything. Just thought it would be nice.
I was reading the Kama Sutra. I'm super spiritual now, but like I think the majority of people watching my channel are more likely to be those who are critical of organized religion by virtue of this kind of historical narrative that pervades that it's the root of all evil, which is decidedly not.
This is what I meant by not trusting any of the religious authorities.
Yeah, in that case, I think it would just help to kind of poke some holes into that narrative, like.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I was originally atheist, and I viewed it all as feelings. You know how you do. But the thing is that I have always, since I was a very, very little kid, been absolutely blooming obsessed with history. So it was only a matter of time before I started encountering the church in my history, and I read obsessively about it. My trip actually started with a professor at a I think it's a Lutheran seminary in the States called Ryan Reeves. He goes to I think it's Robert Conwell, I think it's called. And I found it absolutely fascinating because in the history of religion you see so much of the way people think manifest, and you start observing certain things and you start treating the sources from religious people seriously. For example, I'm sure the spiritual yet not religious people will concede that there are miracles. These things are true, but the real red pill is when you start to notice there are types. There are 27,000 saints, and there are certain types of miracles that are repeated constantly. And I always had a level of skepticism being an atheist of miracles. But as I got more religious, I noticed these types, and I was like, holy moly, right? I can put these in, I can actually make these into a science. I can actually, like, you know, mark off the boundaries on this particular area of knowledge about miracles based on the fact that there are types that repeatedly happen. For example, there are hundreds of saints who can speak to people and in like someone who doesn't know the language, and they'll be understood. So the classic example of this is St. Peter at Pentecost speaking to the crowd, and everyone understood him in their own language. But a more contemporary example is the Eastern Orthodox Saint Paisios of Mount Athos, who once had a Spanish lady come over for advice, and granted this man was from Greece, because Mount Athos is in Greece, and she had an interpreter who was from Germany, but knew, you know, obviously Greek and Spanish to communicate. And eventually this translator was not needed. She just sort of sat there as Saint Paisios would answer the Spanish questions in Greek, and they could both understand each other. Another one, you know, healing by touching. Hundreds of people have done this, thousands. Of course, Christ did it, but so did Saint Thomas Aquinas, and just like thousands of saints. Another one. This is the really weird one as well. There's a number of different saints, particularly monks, who levitate while they pray. So the earliest one I can remember is Saint Mary of Egypt, who was in the 4th century, but you have some that are far closer to home. You've got Saint John of the Cross, you have Saint Teresa of Avila, and the one that is especially hilarious, man, I've completely lost his Saint Philip Neri, right? This man would levitate so much that he'd have to intentionally stop himself praying so he could walk inside the church for mass, because otherwise he'd just float above the door. It was like, and these things happen, like, there are dozens and dozens of people. In fact, there are prayer manuals that I own that make provision for this kind of thing, right? There are types that manifest themselves, and where there are types you can create sciences, and where there are sciences there are logics defining them, and therefore we can systematize even spiritual experiences in a scientific way, which is ultimately why you should stay away from spiritual, not religious. And you should also not doubt religious authorities, because ultimately what hierarchies do is they stratify and define types within an organized structure. And that's why you have organized religion. Now, these are obviously not always perfect. I mean, I'm sure that you're shrieking about, all the various horrible things that Catholics have done. Yes, these things are by nature imperfect. But, I mean, I'd say the Catholic Church is inspired by God, because that's what it says, and that's what all of the evidence points to. But even within other religions with these sorts of structures, they do a similar thing. And that's the benefit of having, a structured, organized religion. Does anyone else have anything to add?
Well, when you have a society or a community of any kind, it's always ordered towards some purpose. And if it's, especially if it's above the level of a family, if you're organizing more than one family, and a religious society, a society wherein the religion is one that is organized,
actually, that's
going
one point.
to order.
That's one point,
yeah?
Actually. Religious, the word religious comes from religion, of course, and religion comes from religio in Latin, which means the set of rules or laws that a society follows.
Yeah. If you don't have a religious community, then the general, if you don't have an organized one, there is no way that your general society will be ordered to the ends that is called for by the faith.
You need,
so whatever
you need
faith
a religion
you have,
to have a society in the first place, and when you lose that religion, the society collapses. Even if the religion is true or false, right? If you've got a set of rules, laws that you follow in that society, and you aren't entirely at the whims of human wills, and human, like ambitions.
passions,
Ambitions. You're fucked if you're just depending on those things. You're completely fucked, and that's why we've seen the degeneration in our society today. So, Franzel, have you got anything to add?
Mm, not really, except for perhaps when it comes to people who are skeptical of organized religion. I think that part of that also kind of goes back to like many popular myths about the Middle Ages, and the perhaps for some people who are perhaps a bit more skeptical-minded about the relationship between science and the church in the Middle Ages, which might turn them to be more skeptical of organized religion. And
Actually, that's a question I wanted to ask the audience. I'm going to release a free audiobook next week because I normally give these out on Renaissance Man, but I figured since I've given a free controversial video, next week I'll give a free audiobook. Now you have two choices. You have Aquinas on, on running a society, on law, on moral law. Specifically a book called On Princely Government, which has a ton of red pills, with like intense red pills, things that I didn't realize, right? That I mean, for example, he says something along the lines of like tyrannical governments create cucks because in order to retain control, they have to cuckold the population deliberately, and stuff like that, which weren't, initially obvious to me. Or you can have St. John of the Cross on why desires are bad, and essentially he spends out a good 50 pages explaining why you ought to resist, these attachments to things like having a wank, as much as you can. So, I mean, in the description, tell me. But did anyone else have anything to add on to this question before we go on to the final one?
Since I'm also an audience member, I'd like to say that I want the second one. But anyway,
you already have the Patreon though, so you've already got it.
Should. Oh yeah. Well, I thought you were making it. Never mind. Whatever.
Well, I was going to re-release it because I figured it's such an incredibly useful thing that I think everyone should have that I'll just give it out for free. Anyway.
All right.
So assuming we're done with that question now, this is the final one. This is a lot more of an opinion piece, so I'll start off with this one if you don't mind. Which saint, if any, inspired you most when converting? Which passage of scripture gave you a clearer view of Christ's church being the Catholic Church? From Matthew. So, the saint which I'm going to be confirmed as is going to be Saint Ephrem the Syrian. He was a lyric poet who wrote just reams and reams of poetry, but he had a life that is very much like mine. He was originally ruled very much by anger and by, like rebelling, but like not just in this kind of hippy dippy bollocks way, like serious shit, like in prison kind of stuff. Like he wasn't like doing doobies and rebelling against the system. No, this guy was thrown in prison accused of stealing sheep. And the way he approached it reminded me very much of myself. And eventually he became a monk and the assistant to the bishop where he lived, and produced some of the most profound theological poetry ever written. He's a doctor of the church. But the guy who inspired me the most, up to this point besides him, would be Saint Moses the Ethiopian. A man who was a bandit and murdered people and, just did all sorts of horrific things. In fact, one time,
He was Ethiopian?
Yeah, he was from Ethiopia. Saint Moses the Black was from Ethiopia. He comes from Aethiops, which refers to, the dark people south of Egypt. So he could have come from Sudan. But one time, a shepherd was out with his sheep, and his dog barked as he saw Moses approach, because he wanted to steal the sheep. So Moses went away. And he didn't only want to steal sheep though; he also wanted to rob the person's house. So he goes over to the sheep, and he kills all of the rams of the herd, so the herd can't sustain itself. And just purely out of spite because this dog was barking, right? And just sells the hides and eats the meat. But eventually he finds himself in a monastery in Egypt. And he has this great story of repentance and eventually is martyred by brigands. If you want to see videos on them, there's two great videos on both these saints on Trisagion Films, which is, although it's Eastern Orthodox, does some incredible videos. So I'm going to link them in the description as well. Guys, do you want to continue? Do you want to answer the question?
Go on, Franzel. Who's your which saints? affected you the most?
That's honestly kind of a bit of a hard question because I admittedly still have to do some research on the Saints, but
You'll be there a while. There's 27,000.
yeah, I know, but I personally really like Thomas Aquinas. Which mostly just for personal reasons because I'm kind of read into the Summa and like going through his philosophy and theology stuff kind of helped me get back into theism and Christianity and yeah.
I thought my internet had gone there for a second. You just sort of stayed.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Hasan?
Right. Well, I kind of had this. I was one of the cringe high Tory people on Twitter a few years ago. And one of the when I was reading into things, one of the things there is a channel which was once great, Master Brew. I'm sure you've heard of him. And now he's cringe, right? Now he's absolute cringe. And you know, I watched one of his most recent videos recently, and I thought, it's interesting. This is exactly what happened to the Anglican Church. First they were slightly wrong, and now they're very wrong. Like, you know, he got to the end, and this last video, and he's just got like some Love Island meme, and it's some woman dressed like a whore. Like, why are you glorifying this idiot? But anyway, that's not really the point. He had a really good video on honor, and it was an excerpt from the writing of Saint Alfred the Great. And hearing that made me think, wow, he said what he said and the way he set it out was something that I found very, very profound. So I went and listened to more of what he said, and I was surprised to find that we actually have a lot recorded from him. When I read into him, he had a really great effect, and I was still Muslim at the time. He had a very big effect on my approach to spirituality, my understanding of.
Yeah, for the benefit of those people who couldn't hear him properly because he broke up a little, St. Alfred the Great. Many people forget about the thing that people forget about St. Alfred, and he's only a local saint here in England, is that he was actually very philosophically minded. In fact, he produced the first English translation of the Consolation of Philosophy by St. Boetius. So, in terms
You
of
should listen to his life story. He went to Rome and studied theology for like 5 years when he was a teenager. His dad took him and he just stayed there for 5 years and studied in Rome. And then he went back and revitalized Anglo-Saxon Christianity with a much more thorough, strict, scholastic understanding of the faith.
Okay, in terms of passages of scripture, though, I don't think there's really much we can really say beyond Matthew 16. You know, thou art Peter, and upon this rock I shall build my church. When he changes his name, and I think it's in John 21 or 22 when he goes, "Peter, feed my sheep." Yeah, I mean, I don't know how much clearer it can really get. I mean,
what about the parable of the house on the rock versus the house on the sand?
Oh yeah, that as well. I mean, there's so many allusions to it that if you, I mean, it's hard to avoid them. It's just so obvious.
Well, I'll put something forward. It was in Matthew 7, wasn't it? The parable of the house on the rock.
Yeah, I mean, an interesting red pill is that Luther, until the Pope disagreed with him, conceded that thou art Peter, and then after that he burnt a code of canon law, a Summa Theologiae, and then split from the church when the church disagreed with him. It's a very interesting
burning
story.
the Summa Theologiae.
Yeah, I actually made an audiobook on it. It's a very interesting story behind Luther. Anyway.
Very interesting, yeah. Anyway, so what I wanted to say was that remember what the verse says when Christ says, thou art Peter. Just before that, he goes, he tells him, flesh did not reveal this to you? After he asks them the question of who am I, and he tells them, you are the Son of the living, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And he says, he blessed him and said, it is not flesh that revealed this to you. And who did he say revealed it to him? Who did he say revealed it to Peter?
Oh, I thought that was a rhetorical question. Are you gonna?
No. I was asking you to answer.
Well, I think if you recall, it's specifically his faith or something like that.
No, it's the Father.
Yes.
The Father.
Yeah.
Your Father in heaven who told you this, right? And then if we go to Matthew 7, when Christ is talking, when he talks about the house upon the rock, house upon the Petron in the Greek, right?
I'm not gonna have to go grab my blooming interlinear, am I?
No, you're not. No, we're not gonna go into that, right? But then he says, he says that the person who does not do, he says, many will say, Lord, Lord to me, and I will say, I never knew you, which is terrifying, right? And he doesn't only say that, because that might go for people who, maybe we could say that about Protestants, but what about the other parts of of Christianity who are not only baptized but have valid priests? Well, Christ says that they will say, did we not cast out demons in your name and work miracles and heal people? And basically what is implied there is that they will be able to do those things. They will have valid priestly ordination. But he then says, but you worked in lawlessness, iniquity, right?
You're really eating on the ecumenical patriarch right now. It's quite
Yeah.
harsh. It's pretty harsh there.
Yeah, but he said, well, Christ is eating on him. It's not me. So Christ said in Matthew 7, these are the people who built the house on sand. They didn't build it on Peter.
Anyway,
And that's
yeah.
what solidifies that question for me. The answer to that question.
Yeah, we've gone on for almost an hour, so I think it's time to bring it to a close. Franzel, any final thoughts?
No, not really.
Okay, anticlimactic. Hasan?
On what? This was very specific, question oriented. You want go back and summarize anything we've already talked about, or?
Well, I mean, just give me a summary. Like, it's a choice, Hasan. It's a choice. Autism is a choice.
Well, I to summarize, I'm gonna go back to something I said earlier. I hope you guys found this all interesting. And even more than that, I hope you go and read. Don't just listen to the video and leave.
Read book.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
there are two things this channel teaches. It's to try and extract maximum possible virtue out of guys and myself, and to get you guys to read. Read. Avoid thoughts and read. Disregard women, acquire books.
It's not good enough to listen to people talk about the books they've read on YouTube.
I mean, you end up with people Jay Dyer when you don't read, right? You end up with Jay Dyers when you don't read.
Yeah, because people like him get support. Maybe he reads, but the people who watch him have never read any of the books that he talks about all the way through.
The amount of books that he claims to have read, and they say the exact opposite.
Yeah.
I mean, he's the prime
Dude,
example, but it goes everywhere. Like the Amazing Atheist, just to quote Marcus Aurelius, to undermine God. For example, I mean, let's just disregard that he was decidedly a theist. Yeah, I mean, they may have been materialists, the Stoics, but they didn't dismiss the gods.
Yeah, he even said God singular at times. But look, when people are making these kinds of channels for you, even if they don't say it explicitly, you should take what they are saying as a sort of summary. It's like when you listen to a college lecture. It's not sufficient. It's like an introduction to a topic.
Yeah, like I'll say right now.
You are then.
Yeah, I don't have a sodding clue. right? Like, I've done stuff in my life and I'll talk about it on the channel, but most of it comes from books that I know I can trust, because these things have sustained themselves for so long. I wouldn't...
Yeah.
I like, on my own, I couldn't give you much advice in the way of women, because I'm 21. I couldn't, but King Solomon, I mean, there's a reason why these books have existed for 3,000 years in various forms.
Yeah. You need to go and look into the things that are being said,
You know, you can get
and
rid
do
of all,
more than look
yeah.
at excerpts on Wikipedia and whatever. This
You
is
could
not
get
good
rid
enough.
of
Go and read a
90
book.
You could get rid of 90% of these self-help, self-improvement YouTube people if people just picked up the Book of Proverbs and studied it relentlessly. You wouldn't need them.
Man, you'd only need to read it once. Your life
I mean,
would
I've read
change.
it. Well, I'm on the second read. I'm on the second read of the book, right? And I'm meditating on each proverb every day, and it's literally just like, I mean, you could buy so many books. Like, you could buy your Robert Kiyosaki. You could read your MJ DeMarco. You could get all of these different people, but really, you can just find it in the Bible if you've got a good translation. Just get a good translation. Like, get a Do I Read?
Yep.
That's another one I'm going to link.
And this is the next one for you guys out there who aren't necessarily coming from Coach Red Pill. If you're Catholic or Orthodox, stop being a retard. You live in the 21st century. Go and read the Church Fathers. You can find most of their writings available, translated online in English. Most of the really high-profile ones you can read.
New Advent. Go on New Advent. That's
Yeah.
another one I'm going to link. I've got like
Yep.
I've got like 8 links down in the description.
Yeah, I mean, look, a lot of people have said to me, and I don't like this being put on me, things like, oh, Hasan, you've only been a believer for 7 months. How do you know this, this, and this? And it amazes me because it doesn't actually take that much effort to pick up paper or type in a sentence, which is the title of a book, on Google, and then start putting your eyes over words.
Yeah, it's like there are
It
people,
really doesn't take much effort.
Yeah, I mean, like, there are people who claim that I'm some sort of genius in my church because I can quote, like, you know, parts of St. John Chrysostom from memory. It's like, well, I read the works. I mean, of course I can. It's difficult
You
for
don't
average
have to be smart to read a book, for goodness sake.
Like, get a dictionary, get a Scholastic or a Latin dictionary, and start reading them. I mean, if you find a word you have a problem with, Google it or use the dictionary. It's that simple, guys. Don't be afraid of books. I mean, some people, one woman came up to me and she said, "Well, you must be really smart because you can read the Summa." And it's like, have you ever even picked up the Summa? There are aspects that are difficult, but all it requires is a bit of perseverance.
That's the thing. A lot of it is apprehension. A lot of people are really apprehensive about starting, and they're like, oh, but it must be so complicated. No, but you haven't even had a look yet. You don't even know.
I mean, just
try first.
I mean, like, what do you think is going to happen? Do you think that, like Thomas Aquinas is going to punch you in the mouth through the pages? Do you think, like, what are you afraid of? Is someone going to think you're a big brain because you're reading the book? Well, so what? So what? Like, you live in this world, you won't be able to experience everything. Books are shorthand experience. Read them.
If you're on Discord, start a like-minded server with like-minded people, or join one that already exists. And do readings together.
There's a link in the description for Renaissance Man. We do that kind of stuff there.
Yeah. You should proactively join the Renaissance Man server and say, can we read this book together? And someone will do a reading of it, scheduled, say, once a day or once every 2 days or something.
I mean, I'm going through
at a regular time.
Logic by Joseph Dopp at the moment, which is a book on logic. Anyway, we've got over an hour, and I want to actually be able to upload this by Saturday. We're recording it on Thursday night for reference.
Yeah.
So,
all right.
Anyway, thanks everyone for watching.
I need to get up early as well.
Yeah. See you later, guys. Goodbye.
See ya.
Bye.
A very big thank you to those on the list here. These are subscribers to the Renaissance Man program who get audiobooks and controversial videos every week for $5 a month. There's already quite a lot of content there, so if you check it out in the description, you won't be missing out. Thank you.